The Remainers in Parliament are getting desperate again as we get closer to the June deadline when both the UK and the EU have to decide whether they want to extend the transition period. So there is a new private members bill in Parliament proposed by people like Ed Davey, the Lib Dems, Labour Party, that is going to be asking the government to request a 2-year extension to the Brexit transition. So a bill to require Her Majesty's government to seek a 2-year extension of the implementation period under Article 132 of the withdrawal agreement. This is because Michel Barnier has been talking to the opposition parties and he's been begging them to help him delay Brexit again. And he thought that because Boris Johnson is in trouble with Dominic Cummings and everything, he could use this opportunity, and there are 40 MPs in Parliament, Tory MPs against the government. He thought that he could use this opportunity to get those Tory rebels to vote with them. He didn't realise that a lot of those Tory rebels are Brexiteers, including Steve Baker, and they're not going to vote with you. They're not going to win this vote. It's a desperation move. It's a desperate move, and but on this issue, we have a special guest with us today. We have Douglas Carswell, the co-founder of the Vote Leave campaign and former Member of Parliament. So let's go to Douglas and see what he thinks of this whole situation. So now we're joined by Douglas Carswell, the former Member of Parliament and also the co-founder of the Vote Leave campaign. Welcome to the show, Douglas. How are you?
Hi, it's great to be with you. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. How's the lockdown treating you?
It's a lot worse for many other people. I mean, it's not been easy, but I'm one of the lucky ones. I can work from home. Unlike a lot of people, I've managed to carry on doing the things I was doing beforehand pretty successfully. But I'm looking forward to normal life resuming soon.
Yeah, no, it's been the same for me because I work from home anyway. We usually walk around the park, so it hasn't really affected me in that sense. There's a lot happening these days. And we thought because of the lockdown nothing's going to be happening, but actually that's created new problems. Before we talk about the media and the lockdown and everything, there's a new private members bill in Parliament put forward by like the Remainers, Ed Davey and everyone, trying to force the government to request an extension to the Brexit transition. I think they're desperate.
What a surprise. I mean, these are the people who campaigned against us leaving the European Union, who spent 3 years refusing to accept the verdict of the people, now trying every trick in the book. Just stop and ask yourself, what conceivable reason would we want to extend? If we extend, it's not going to bring forward a new deal or a new attitude with Brussels. What this is fundamentally about is an attempt by career politicians like Ed Davey to keep us locked into the ambit, the orbit of the European Union. And I also think it's worth noting that clearly that there's an orchestrated attempt colluding with Barnier in Brussels to ask for an extension. And some of that, I can't help thinking, seems to be tied in with this vociferous attack on Dominic Cummings, who of course was one of the chief architects of Vote Leave's success. So I suspect there's an operation being run, and I suspect that Brussels is in on it. Yeah. And I think it's quite shameful, or it would be rather shameful, if British politicians were colluding with Brussels to try to bring this about. They won't succeed, but I think it's rather telling.
Yeah, because I think what they've smelt desperation and trouble, especially within the government. They think that because there are 40-ish Tory MPs against the government or against Dominic Cummings, that means 40 MPs will vote for this bill. One of those MPs is Steve Baker. He's not going to vote for the bill. It makes absolutely no sense. So I don't think this is the attempt to win the argument in Parliament. My view is they're doing this. They know they're going to lose in Parliament, but they know the power of the mainstream media and the pressure that they could put to the government. And it was the media's fault that we did a full blanket lockdown. And they're basically hoping that they could use the media again to force Boris Johnson to say the public want an extension. What do you think?
And also, just never underestimate the fundamental stupidity of a lot of career politicians in the House of Commons. A lot of them don't think that Britain should be an independent country. They refuse to accept the referendum result, and they will do anything they can to try to prevent the government enacting the referendum result.
So yeah, you're right. But on the other hand, the whole European Union side, they are obviously desperate as well, and they're in a weird situation because they are battling a lot of things inside the eurozone with Germany and everywhere. Why can't they use this opportunity to just give in and say, we need a trade deal, so let's just have a trade deal instead of this political alignment and everything? Why are they still pushing?
I think it'd be helpful if we just take a moment to reflect on what it is that Brussels is asking from these negotiations. What they're saying is that in order for us to be able to sell our goods and services to those within the European Union, we would need to not only hand over in perpetuity the rights to European countries to fish in our fishing waters, which is a relatively minor sector of our economy, but we would agree that the entirety of the UK economy should be bound to follow EU rules and regulations, whatever those regulations were. And just no sovereign independent country would possibly do that. So I think actually there's incredibly bad faith on the part of the Brussels negotiators in all of this. I suspect that actually the member states, the governments of Germany and France and Italy that are accountable to their people are going to have to take a decision. Either they're going to have to leave it to Brussels and Barnier to persist with this, in which case there's not going to be any kind of deal and we're just going to leave on WTO terms. Personally, I don't think that's a bad thing. I would welcome that. It could be that the governments of the member states actually come to their senses. But I've spent many years hoping that member state governments in the European Union would come to their senses on a whole range of issues, from bank reform to migration, and they seem incapable of doing so. Yeah. So, fundamentally, I don't think that Brussels is negotiating in good faith. I don't see how we can possibly agree to what they're asking for, and I don't really think it matters anymore. The sooner we realign ourselves away from what is ultimately a hostile Brussels empire, the better.
Yes, and I think the moment we go back to normality after lockdown, which should be basically July and August, latest, the media are gonna go crazy again on this issue. Then they're gonna find a new way to attack Dominic Cummings, for example. So actually, on that issue, what do you think of this whole thing with BBC Newsnight and the reporters outside Dominic's house and all this crazy stuff?
Just take a moment. Fatalities from this terrible epidemic are falling. Right around the world, countries are lifting their lockdown restrictions, and there's very little sign, if any, of a second wave of infections. The end of this crisis is in sight. You would expect that would be leading the news items. Instead, what we've seen is broadcasters obsessing about the childcare arrangements of a special advisor. It's quite extraordinary how bad the broadcast media has been over the past couple of months. When we went into this crisis, there were all sorts of questions we needed to know and needed to be asked about the virus. We needed to do all sorts of things to try to learn about this epidemic. They didn't ask those sorts of questions. There were all sorts of questions they should have asked about the economy and the effect of the lockdown on the economy that were never asked and still haven't been properly examined. And yet instead we see this extraordinarily bad gotcha journalism. And we saw on Newsnight a couple of nights ago with Emily Maitlis this brazen example or not even a pretense at impartiality. And I have to say, I don't think this is the broadcast media's finest hour. Emily Maitlis produces current affairs programs for a living. The Newsnight team produce programs like this for a living. And yet they fail to adhere to basic elementary guidelines on impartiality. And not only that, having been caught red-handed by their own BBC team, they're completely unapologetic. I think it's actually worth reading out a tweet from Emily Maitlis, and I share it with your viewers. Having been caught out breaching these basic rules, she tweets out, being overwhelmed by all the kindness, messages and support on here. And I probably missed much of it. A big thanks from all of us at Newsnight. It's a complete lack of apology.
I did nothing wrong.
The arrogance of it is extraordinary. This is someone who's paid over £250,000 a year to produce current affairs programs, and who, having failed to adhere to basic standards of impartiality, thinks that that is an appropriate response. I hope that many of your viewers will refuse to pay their license fee. I think it's morally and ethically justifiable to not pay now.
No, I fully agree. And to be fair, it's not just the BBC or the question of impartiality. It's just the stupidity of the modern journalists that we have. Robert Peston keeps asking weird questions every day at these daily briefings. Makes absolutely no sense. And Matt Hancock, I don't fully support him politically because he's more towards the left. But he's been very good at slamming Rob Peston during his conferences.
You're right. You summed it up with the word stupidity. I don't mean that as a term of abuse, but the level of questioning, the standard of questioning of broadcast journalism. And I think one should differentiate between broadsheet newspapers and tabloid newspapers, where you know what you're getting. There's a particular subjective and an honest subjectivity, whether it's to the Guardian or to the Daily Mail. But it's the broadcast media that I think has got itself into such a mess over this whole issue. Let's just take a step back. 2 months ago, there was this deadly virus that seemed to be growing exponentially. No significant questions were asked by the broadcast journalism about the lockdown response. There was all this hyperboil about clamping down on people sunbathing, all these questions insisting and demanding that we prevent people from going to parks. And yet no one asked intelligent questions about how this virus was spreading through the care homes. Over 40% of all deaths in this country, or approaching 40% of all deaths in this country, have taken place in care homes. We locked down the parks and we stopped the sunbathing, but the media never asked the questions that needed to be asked. And I think they share a lot of the blame in this. If public policy has sometimes not been what it should, we need to ask why it is that those who have a special responsibility to hold policymakers to account are obsessing about gotcha issues and not asking intelligent, sensible questions.
No, you're right. It is. They have to have some sort of responsibility as well. Because yesterday I had a bit of a clash with Piers Morgan on Twitter, and then in my video last night I did say that Piers Morgan claims that Dominic Cummings' action, driving somewhere without actually being near anyone or socially not socially distancing, it would cost lives. And I said, no, your behaviour, Piers Morgan, is what will cost lives, because from day one, he's been scaring people, and he's been telling people that you can't leave your house, and there are cancer patients and people who needed treatment, who needed to go to hospital, but they thought, well, they're not allowed to because Piers Morgan told me we're not allowed to, and now they're in trouble.
Well, I had my own lockdown policy on Piers Morgan some time ago. I blocked him on Twitter because I couldn't stand the sort of sanctimonious, self-righteous outrage. I've never watched his TV show. And you know what? I suspect more people now probably watch you every day on a screen in Britain somewhere than watch Piers Morgan. And they'll be better for it. There's a sort of relentless pessimism and sort of high moral grandstanding on some of these shows that I find slightly off-putting. Now, I think the future now is your show, nothing to do with Good Evening Britain or whatever it was called.
Thank you very much. And thanks for coming on the show again. Hopefully, after this whole chaos, we could do it in person. I know you don't really drink beer, but when the pubs open or something, when things open, we could do it for an afternoon tea or something.
Let's meet for tea. I've been drinking a lot of tea. Let's meet for a cup of tea.
Let's do afternoon tea, as long as you don't do jam first. Always cream first.
Cheerio.
Thank you very much.